I was 43 years old when I found out my father had another wife. I found out at his funeral. She was standing at the front of the church, in the seat that should have been my mother's. My name is Vivian. My father was Walter Crane. For my entire life, he was a quiet man who worked for a regional freight company and traveled 3, sometimes 4 days a week. That was normal. That was just Dad. He'd come home Thursday nights with a paper bag of butterscotch candies, and he'd sit at the kitchen table and ask me about school, and I would tell him everything. He never missed a birthday. Not one. 43 birthdays. 43 phone calls or 43 cakes. Whatever else is true about the man, that part is also true. And I need you to hold both of those things at once. Because I've had to. My mother died in 2019. Pancreatic cancer. 8 months from diagnosis to the end. My father sat beside her hospital bed every single day of those 8 months. I watched him hold her hand while she was unconscious and talk to her about the garden. I watched him weep in a hospital parking lot in a way I had never seen a man weep. I know now that on the first of every one of those 8 months, an automatic payment left an account in his name and went toward a mortgage 4 hours away. 8 payments. 8 months of her dying. He never once had to think about it. That was the point of setting it up that way. He held her hand, and the money moved, and neither thing interrupted the other. He died 4 years later, heart attack at 71, alone in a motel room in Ohio. The police called me because I was the emergency contact in his wallet. I planned the funeral. Small church, the one my mother had liked. I chose the flowers she would have chosen. I wrote the obituary myself, in one sitting, at 2 in the morning, and it took me 4 hours because I kept stopping to cry. Beloved husband of the late Margaret Crane, devoted father of Vivian. That's what I wrote. That's what the program said in the little folded booklets at the front of the church on the morning of the funeral, when a woman I had never seen before walked in wearing black and sat down in the front pew. She had 2 adult sons with her. I remember thinking, with total calm, that she must be from his work. That's what your brain does. It reaches for the reasonable explanation, and it holds on to it, and it will hold on to it for as long as you let it. Then the older of the 2 men, he was maybe 35, leaned over and adjusted the collar of the man in the casket, the way a son does. I walked up the aisle. I said, "Excuse me, I'm sorry, who are you?" And she looked at me with this terrible, patient gentleness, and she said, "You must be Vivian. He talked about you. I'm Rosalie." And then she said, "I'm his wife. 31 years. Married in 1992, in Ohio. 11 years after he married my mother. Never divorced from either of us. 2 sons, Peter and Daniel. Peter had my father's hands. I noticed it in a diner parking lot that afternoon and I had to look away. People imagine that afternoon as a screaming match. It wasn't. Rosalie didn't know about me either. Not really. She knew he had a daughter from a first marriage that ended in 1990. He told her my mother was a woman who had left him. He told her I was distant, cold, difficult. He had a story about me. He'd been telling it for 31 years to a woman who cooked his dinner 4 nights a week. And he had a story about her he never told me at all. Because I wasn't a problem he needed to explain. I was a life he simply left 3 days a week and returned to on Thursdays with butterscotch candies. 2 households, 4 hours apart on the interstate, 31 years. Sit with the logistics of that. Every Christmas he was on a run. Every anniversary he couldn't get out of. Every birthday party he arrived at late and left early. Every single one of those was a departure from a room where someone else was also waiting for him. Here's where it gets worse, and I promise you, it gets worse. 3 weeks after the funeral, I sat down to settle the estate. My father was not a wealthy man. A house, the house I grew up in, the house my mother's parents helped them buy in 1981, the house where my mother died in a hospital bed we set up in the living room because she wanted to see the garden. The deed had been transferred in 2021, 2 years after my mother died, into the names of Peter and Daniel Crane. My father had signed my mother's house over to his other sons while I was still going through her closets, deciding which of her sweaters to keep. I want to tell you I screamed. I didn't. I sat in a lawyer's office and I looked at a piece of paper with my father's handwriting on it. That familiar, cramped, slanted handwriting from 43 birthday cards. And I felt something in my chest go very, very quiet. And in that quiet, I started reading. Because here's the thing about a man who lives 2 lives for 31 years. He generates paper. He has to. 2 mortgages, 2 sets of tax returns, 2 insurance policies, 2 identities that have to be maintained, funded, filed, and reconciled every single April. And a man like that is not careful. He can't afford to be careful. He's exhausted. I spent 4 months in county records offices. I am not a lawyer. I'm a school administrator. I read budgets for a living, and I know how to follow a number backward through a filing system until it tells me where it came from. And what the numbers told me was this. The mortgage on the Ohio house, Rosalie's house, had been paid down for 19 years out of an account that was fed by the equity line on my mother's house. My mother spent 19 years working double shifts as a pharmacy tech to help pay a mortgage on a house that was quietly bleeding into a home she never knew existed, for children she never knew existed, in a state she'd never been to. She died believing they were behind on payments because of her medical bills. She apologized to him. In the hospital. I was in the room. She apologized to my father for the cost of dying. That is the sentence I could not get past. Not the wife, not the sons, not the house. That one. So I built the case. Properly. Not out of rage. Rage is loud and stupid, and it loses in court. I did it the way I balance a district budget. Slowly, in columns, with receipts. I found a lawyer named Ellis, a woman in her 60s who had spent 30 years on estate fraud, who looked at my folders for a long time and then said one word: bigamy. Because the second marriage, in 1992, was void. Not voidable, void. It never legally existed, which meant Rosalie was never his wife, which meant every asset transferred to her sons, funded by marital property from a valid marriage, was subject to being clawed back into my mother's estate, which meant that with one filing, I could take the house Peter and Daniel had grown up in, the house they had just buried their father from. I could take the money out from under them, and I could do it legally. And Ellis told me, sitting across her desk, that I would almost certainly win. I drove to Ohio. I sat in Rosalie's kitchen, a small kitchen, yellow curtains, a photograph on the refrigerator of my father at a barbecue, holding a spatula and laughing in a way I do not think I ever saw him laugh. And I laid out every document on her table. The equity line, the transfers, the 19 years. And I watched her face while she understood that the man she had loved for 3 decades had funded her life by draining a dying woman's home. She didn't defend him. That's what undid me. She didn't say there must be an explanation. She put her hand over her mouth and she said, "Oh God, Margaret." She said my mother's name like a prayer for someone she'd wronged without knowing. And Peter, 35 years old, my father's hands, stood in the doorway and said, "We'll sign it back. Whatever it is, we'll sign it back today." And I realized, sitting in that yellow kitchen, that I had driven 4 hours to destroy 2 men who were exactly as lied to as I was, who had also gotten the butterscotch candies, who had also been told a story about a cold, distant relative 4 hours down the interstate. He hadn't chosen them over me. He had used all of us, evenly, for 31 years. There was no favorite family. There was just a man who wanted 2 lives and made 4 people pay for it. I did file. I want to be honest about that, because I think people expect the story to end with me tearing up the paperwork in a moment of grace. And that's not what happened. I filed to recover the equity, the 19 years of my mother's money, documented to the dollar. Ellis calculated it at just under $290,000. And I did not file to take the house. I could have. It was the stronger claim. Ellis told me twice.
But my mother spent 19 years paying for a house she never saw, so that 2 boys she never met could grow up in it. And if I took it from them now, I wouldn't be undoing what my father did. I'd just be finishing it.
Peter and Daniel repaid the equity over 2 years. They sold my father's truck. Rosalie sold the jewelry he'd given her, which, and neither of us could speak for a while after we worked this out, had been bought the same week my mother's health insurance lapsed. I used the money to pay off my mother's remaining medical debt, which my father had never touched, and which had been quietly sitting in collections for 4 years. She died apologizing for that debt. It took me 11 minutes on the phone to erase it. 11 minutes. He never made that call. I speak to Rosalie about once a month now. There is no word for what we are. Not family, not friends,
Not enemies. We were never on opposite sides of anything. We were on opposite sides of him. Here is the closest I've come to naming it. Rosalie and I are the only 2 people alive who know who Walter Crane actually was. She has half of him, and I have the other half, and neither half makes sense alone. I can't put him down because she's still holding her end, and she can't put him down either. Peter sends me a card at Christmas. It's signed just Peter, not your brother. He's careful about that, and I'm grateful, and I've never told him so. People ask me if I forgave my father. That's the question, always, and I think people ask it because they want permission, either to forgive someone or to stop trying. I'll tell you what I've got instead. My father was, for 8 months, at a hospital bedside, the most tender man I have ever seen. And on the first of each of those months, the money moved. Both are true. Neither cancels the other. I've stopped waiting for one of them to win. What I refuse to do is let the tenderness be the whole story. That's what he was counting on. That's what men like him always count on. That we'll remember the butterscotch and not the arithmetic. I remember both. That's my inheritance, and I'm keeping it. So here's my question for you. If you found out that someone you loved had been living a second life, would you want to know every detail? Or would you rather have kept the version of them you had? There's no wrong answer. I've changed my mind about it twice this year. Tell me in the comments. I read every single one. Thank you for watching Stories That Matter. If this story stayed with you, subscribe. New stories every week.